So hello everyone and welcome to your channel of Pharmacology, where today we will be discussing about the topic of pharmacoepidemiology. So without taking much time, let us begin. Now students, before moving forward, we have to understand what are the insufficiencies of a clinical trial. Now a detailed video on clinical trial has already been uploaded in our channel. The link for the same will be given in the description box. Please check it out. Now the information that we get from a clinical trial, they are very partial. They are applicable more to the persons who are a part of the clinical trial, because the clinical trial, the situations of the clinical trial, they are very much controlled. So the real world scenario is very different from the scenarios in the clinical trial. Now the insufficiencies of the clinical trial, they have been summarized as 5 2s. The first two being, the clinical trial, it engages too few patients, right? Because what is the maximum number of patients that are a part of the clinical trial? Suppose the phase 3, a multicentric trial, you will see somewhere in the range of 1500 to say 3000 patients. But the number of patients who will actually consume a drug or who will actually use a drug, they will be far more than the patients who are enrolled in the clinical trial before the drug was getting marketed, right? The second problem is that it is too simple. Now why is it too simple? Because patients who are consuming a number of drugs, right? The polydrug patients, or the patients who have got a lot of comorbid conditions, or patients with polypathological conditions, all these patients, they are normally excluded from the clinical trial. But in the real world scenario, especially with the patients who have got chronic diseases, we can have a comorbid patient, as there can be other comorbid conditions. The patient can consume a number of drugs, more than a single drug, right? So naturally, the clinical trial, in comparison to the real world, it is considered to be too simple. The third point is that it is too concerned with the median ages, right? Because especially the extremes of the age, right? Such as a child, or an old patient, the geriatric age group, normally they are excluded from the clinical trials. But in reality, the geriatric age group, the old patients, they will be the one, especially in case of chronic diseases, who will consume a lot of drugs. And these chronic diseases, suppose a disease like hypertension, or suppose a disease like diabetes, there may be more than one drug, and this treatment, it will also go for a long time. So the chances of these patients being exposed to old and new drugs is far more, but in clinical trials we normally are excluding them. The next insufficiency is that it is too narrow. Since the clinical trial is too narrow, now what we mean by that, that the conditions of a clinical trial, they are highly restricted conditions, and these conditions, they may not always be the conditions that we find in case of real world situations. That is why the conditions, that is why the clinical trial, rather, it has been called to be too narrow. And the last one is that it is too brief, right? Say the phase 3 of a clinical trial prior to the drug getting marketed. It may last for 3 to 5 years on an average. And some of the clinical trials, they may last for months also. So the time gap is very less. But a patient in real world scenario can be treated say 10 years with a drug, or suppose 15 years with a drug. But this clinical trial, it is not going to stimulate that situation. Because of these above reasons, that it being too few patients, too simple, too concerned with the median ages, too narrow and too brief, there have been discrepancies ranging from 30 to more than 60%. And these discrepancies, they have been observed in patient characteristics, when the between a real world patient and the patients who were involved in the clinical trial. The discrepancy ranging between 30 to more than 60%. That is why, students, you must understand that we need something which is going to evaluate the drug in real world scenarios. And that is where the concept of pharmacoepidemiology comes into being. It is going to evaluate the drugs in real world scenarios. So now, if the data has got 30 to 60% discrepancies, then you all will agree that we need to study the drugs in real life situations. And this study of the drug in real life situations is basically from three viewpoints. The first viewpoint is the viewpoint of the population. The second viewpoint, it is from the medical viewpoint. And the third viewpoint is the economic viewpoint. So the study of the drugs in relation to population viewpoint, medical viewpoint and economic viewpoint in real life conditions, this is the goal of pharmacoepidemiology, right? That is, you have studied about pharmacology, now the application of that knowledge of pharmacology to the larger population, to a population, that is pharmacoepidemiology. And further, this pharmacoepidemiology, it has got two words, right? Pharma and epidemiology. So that means, and we are seeing it from the perspective of the human population, for the perspective of the patients. So pharmacoepidemiology, again, it is going to act as a bridge between clinical pharmacology and epidemiology. So as we do, let us now know what is the definition of pharmacoepidemiology. Again, I have broken down the definition in three parts. The first part of the definition, it answers the question, what do we mean by pharmacoepidemiology? Now, pharmacoepidemiology, it is the study of the drugs in real conditions. Now, where will we do this study? The second question is where? We will do this study in case of large population. And what is the aim of our study? We want to know that what is the effect of the drug in relation to the use of the drug, the effectiveness of the drug, and the risk by the drug use. So the definition of pharmacology is now the study of drugs in real conditions and in large population relating to its use, effectiveness and risks. Now if we look into the WHO definition of pharmacoepidemiology, it again basically more or less says the same thing. It says that it is the study of the use and the effects or the adverse or the side effects of the drugs in large number of people with the purpose of supporting the rational and the cost effective use of drugs in the population and thereby ultimately improving the health outcomes. So in case of pharmacoepidemiology, the subunit or the unit of study is population. So the general idea, a general discussion on pharmacoepidemiology. As I've already told you that pharmacoepidemiology, it has got two words. One is pharmaco, one is epidemiology. So it acts as a bridge between clinical pharmacology, because we are concerned with the use of the drug in human population, in the patients, and between epidemiology. So this bridge, it has got a synergy of multiple disciplines. You have got the discipline of epidemiology and pharmacology already. Along with that, there are the disciplines of medicine, biostatistics and social sciences. So all these disciplines, they together constitute the study of pharmacoepidemiology. Now next 2 points are very important. The evidence that we collect from pharmacoepidemiological studies, they are real world evidence. The evidence that is actually existing. We are not simulating any conditions. These are the real world evidences. And the data that we generate from the analysis of the pharmacoepidemiological studies, they are also real world data. So we get real world evidence as well as real world data with the help of pharmacoepidemiology. So now pharmacoepidemiology, it raises some fundamental questions. The questions are either it can be what is or what are the. Now the first question that it raises is that what is the practical scope of the information that has been provided for the drugs at the time of marketing? Because whatever information has been provided for the drug at the time of marketing, those are those information we generate from the clinical trials. But the condition of the clinical trials, they are highly controlled. So we have to understand now the practicality of the information that has been provided. The second point is that the extent and the differing criteria of the real world patients from the participants of the clinical trials. Because the real world patients, they will be different from the patients of the clinical trials. The patient of the clinical trials, they have been selected on the base of some inclusion or some exclusion criteria. They have been rejected from the study based on some exclusion criteria. But those inclusion and exclusion criteria, they may not be a part of the real world. Right? So that is why we have to know what is the differing criteria from the real world patient and the patients that existed in the clinical trials. The third factor is that the third question that arises is, what are the factors that act as a confusion or coherence for the purpose of drug prescription? Because when we are talking about the real world scenarios, there can be a number of factors that ultimately decide the drug prescription behavior as well as the drug consumption behavior, which may not be a part of the actual clinical trial. Now we also have to know what is the adequacy and the timing of the scientific information on the doctor's prescription behavior, and also whether we have a valid criteria for innovation of all products, or whether we can just update the levels, or even we are advertising obsolete products without having any clinical utility. So all these questions, they are raised by the, rather all these fundamental questions, they are raised by the pharmacoepidemiological studies. So now the questions that have been raised by the pharmacoepidemiological study, they also need to be answered. For the purpose of answering the questions of pharmacoepidemiology, there are some methods, and the methodology of the pharmacoepidemiological studies is that they are mostly observational studies, and there are two basic methods for conducting a pharmacoepidemiological study. The first is the descriptive approach, and the second one is the analytical approach. But students, remember that this descriptive and the analytical approach, they are complementary to each other. So now what is the descriptive approach? The descriptive approach, it is a non-comparative approach. That is, we are not comparing the situations in case of a descriptive approach. We are just observing a phenomenon. The type of study, it can be retrospective. Retrospective means that we have got the effect, now we are moving to the cause, right? We are going in the backward direction. Prospective means we have the cause and we are moving towards the effect, right? That is the forward looking studies. Or even cross sectional studies are the studies that are conducted at a particular point of time only. So now the example, it can be, we can have a look at what is the number of drugs that are being prescribed to a female during pregnancy. This kind of a study, it will be answered by the descriptive approach. See, we are not comparing it with anything. We are just observing a phenomenon. So now moving on to the analytical approach. So if you like what we are teaching, then please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to press the bell icon so that you don't miss out on any upcoming videos. So let us proceed. Now the analytical approach, that is a comparative approach or an etiologic approach. This approach, it looks for the association between the occurrence of the effects and the exposure to one or either more drugs, right? That is, there will be an exposure to a drug and there will be an effect because of that exposure. So when we are comparing between these two, then it is known as a comparative approach. As for example, we can study the adverse drug reaction from a pharmacovigilance database with the help of a case non-case method. Now what is a case non-case method? In a case non-case method, we basically investigate the proportionality. Now proportionality between, obviously if it is case and non-case, that means proportionality between two parameters. One will be the case, another will be the non-case. So in case, what we have, we look for the ADRs that have been recorded in the pharmacovigilance database, the ADRs from the drug of interest. And the non-case will be the ADRs, the average number of ADRs that have been recorded with all other drugs. So if we compare these two, the case and the non-case, then we are going to get the number of areas in proportion, the number of areas in the drug of our interest in proportion to the total number of areas. So now with the help of this analytical approach, we have already got the adverse drug reaction for two drugs. The first one is the risk of arrhythmias and the QT prolongation that was reported with citalopram among all the SSRIs. That one we got through this analytical approach. And the second one was among the statins, the major signal for type 2 diabetes mellitus, it was found with atorvastatin, and that too with high dose of atorvastatin. So these two cases we got by the analytical approach, the case and the non-case methods. So now other than the descriptive and the analytical method, which are the two major methods of pharmacoepidemiological study, there are some other methods as well. They are the retrospective or the case control studies. In the case control study, we find the association between a drug and any desirable or undesirable event which was undetectable during the clinical trials. Now, since this retrospective analysis, it includes the cases, hence it can be used for the purpose of detection of rare or the delayed onset events, right? Because we already have the case, right? So the delayed or the rare event, it has already occurred. That is why it can be used for this purpose. The second part is that we can also have the cohort studies. Now cohort studies, they are the method of choice in case of any event which is occurring in a high frequency, the high frequency drug event. For the purpose of those studies, we can do the cohort study. Right now, cohort basically means a group of individuals who are sharing the same characteristics. So suppose I have discovered a new anti-diabetic drug. Now that anti-diabetic drug, it causes hypoglycemia after a prolonged use. So now when it will be given in real life scenarios to the diabetics, there will be a high frequency of this hypoglycemia. So naturally, now we will know that this drug causes hypoglycemia and prolonged use, right? There are other methods as well, other methods such as meta-analysis, there can be database cross-referencing or even case population studies. So all these methods, they are the methods for conducting a pharmacoepidemiological study. Now what is the application of the pharmacoepidemiological study? The main three applications of pharmacoepidemiological study, it can be for studying the prescription and the drug use, for the study of the drug effectiveness, and for the drug safety studies. So now let us have a look into the prescription and the drug use studies. Now drug use has been defined by WHO as the marketing. Initially the drug will come into the market after its approval, so the marketing of the drug, followed by the distribution of the drug to the various distributors, the stores, and after that the drug will be written in a prescription, and after the drug has been written in the prescription, then the drug will be bought and used in the society. So marketing, distribution, prescription, and the use of the drugs in the society, with special emphasis on the resulting medical, social, and the economic consequences. Now if you remember, while discussing the goals of pharmacoepidemiology, we had studied that there are three viewpoints of pharmacoepidemiology. The first is the medical viewpoint. So the medical viewpoint. The second is the population viewpoint, and that is ultimately the social viewpoint. And the third viewpoint is the economic viewpoint. Now these prescription and the drug use studies, they investigate the real life use of the drugs after the drugs have been marketed. Who are actually using drug, in what quantity it is being used, right? What are the hindrances, what are the prescription behaviors? So everything that is happening in the real world, that is what we are getting with the help of these studies. So they investigate the quantitative as well as the qualitative characters of the treated patients, right? How many patients in total are getting treated by the drug, the quantitative character. What is the quality, what is the improvement of life after being treated with this drug, the qualitative parameters. Now what are the prescribers or even the prescribed quantities, what is the quantity in which the drug is actually being prescribed. Even the prescription and the drug use study, they also look into the national or the regional differences in drug use. Even that is also kept in mind, because a particular region of a country, it may have more prevalence of a disease rather than some other part of the country. So there may be some regional differences in the drug distribution of the drug use. There can also be national differences, right? Because you have got an essential medicine list that is given by WHO, but then the Indian government, it also makes its own national list of essential medicines as per its own need. So now the national need may also vary. So this prescription and drug use study, it looks into that parameters as well. Also it looks into what are the determinants of the prescriptions, what are the factors that are actually going into the prescription, right? And also it looks into whether there is any difference from the validated indications, right? That is, whether or not there is a off-label use of the drugs. Right? Off-label drug use means that the drug is used for any other indication other than which it was approved for. And we know a number of drugs that are used for off-label indications based on the clinical observation. It also looks into, or rather it also finds that the prescription and the consumption, they depend on a multiple factors. Now these factors, it can be rational, it can be irrational. So the rational factors are the ones that are coming from the conclusions that we have drawn from the clinical trials. So all those factors are the rational factors. The irrational factors are the ones which we have not drawn any conclusion from the clinical trials. It can be linked to the symbolic images of the drug, or to the social, the economic and the educational factors. But these factors, they have not been derived from the clinical trial. But at the end of the day, these factors may be more important than the rational factors. And these factors, they may actually govern the drug use. Now, to study the drug effectiveness, we can also employ the pharmacoepidemiological study. Now, for the purpose of knowing the efficacy of a drug with the help of pharmacoepidemiological studies, there are two criteria. The first criteria tells us what is the long-term action of the drug, and I'm not talking here in terms of months. We are talking in terms of years. The longer data we have, the better. And the second is, what is the prescriber's goal? What goal does the prescriber actually want to achieve by giving the drug? Suppose the patient has a BP of 180 by 1110 millimeter of mercury, and after giving a drug we want that this BP, it must come down to say less than 140 by 90 millimeter of mercury. So this is the goal of the prescriber. So when these 2 points are considered, after that we see the drug effect in a pharmacoepidemiological study. And this drug effect, it is also seen by the help of 3 very hard clinical criteria. And these clinical criteria are: the drug, it must decrease the morbidity of the patient, it must decrease the mortality of the patient, and in case of mortality we are talking about the total mortality and not only the mortality due to cardiovascular events. And third one is, it must improve the quality of the life of the patient. And this quality of life, there are other valid scales, so they will be judged as per those valid scales. But when we are conducting a clinical trial, then the drug effect is seen, or the drug efficacy is seen based on not this hard clinical criteria, but based on some intermediate criteria. And those criteria are formed by the evaluation of biological samples. There can be ECG evaluations, there can be radiographic evaluation, there can be ultrasound evaluations. So all these evaluations are part of the intermediate criteria, not the hard clinical criteria, which is, so these hard clinical criteria are the ones which will actually go towards the rational prescription and not these intermediate criteria. So since there is a very obvious distinction of the criteria that are being used at the clinical trials and the criteria that are being used in the real world, there are two words. The first is the efficacy and the second is the effectiveness. Whenever we talk about efficacy, we talk about the maximum therapeutic benefit that a drug can attain when the conditions are highly controlled, as happens in case of clinical trial. So efficacy is the maximum therapeutic benefit of a drug in case of controlled conditions, but effectiveness, this is the maximum therapeutic benefit in case of a real world scenario. So efficacy is based on the intermediate endpoints, the endpoints that we are judging at the clinical trial level, whereas effectiveness, it is based on the hard clinical endpoints that we studied just now. Efficacy is judged from clinical trials, the phase 1, 2 and 3. Whereas effectiveness, since it is a real world scenario, it is judged after the post marketing of the drug, that's after the drug has been marketed. It is judged in real world, that is phase 4. Efficacy is judged in an ideal world where there are controlled conditions, whereas effectiveness, it is judged in real world. This is the most important difference, students, please remember it. For the purpose of efficacy, we need clinical pharmacology. But for effectiveness, we need to conduct pharmacoepidemiological studies. Efficacy, it is needed for drug approval, but effectiveness, it is needed for the right prescription. Another very important point. Efficacy for drug approval, but a rational prescription, a right prescription is given by the effectiveness of the drug and not the efficacy of the drug. And the third application of the pharmacoepidemiological studies is on the drug safety study. So drug safety study, it is a pharmacoepidemiological study in which the risk is quantified. The risk of what? The risk that is associated with the drug use. The risk that is associated with drug use. Obviously, for every pharmacoepidemiological study, the unit is the population. Right? So it is quantifying the risk associated with drug use at the population level. That is what a drug safety study is doing. Now what we do presently, we couple the signal detection methods. The signal detection methods in case of large databases, as for example the pharmacovigilance databases. And who are we coupling this signal detection method with? We are coupling these methods with the pharmacological character of the drug. So the signal that has been generated from a large database, say the pharmacovigilance database, that is coupled with the pharmacologic character of the drug. And by pharmacologic character, we basically mean the pharmacodynamic or the pharmacokinetic character. Now, why is it important? It is important because if we do this thing, if we couple the signal of the signal generated from the pharmacovigilance database with the pharmacologic character of the drug, now we can know the mechanism of the adverse drug reactions. And this mechanism of adverse drug reaction, it will be found out from clinical evidence only and not from non-clinical studies, right? So these kind of studies, it is known as PDPE studies, that is pharmacodynamics pharmacoepidemiology studies. Now students, remember this concept. This is a very important concept. So that's it for today everyone. If you like the video, then give it a thumbs up. Also share it among your friends. Do let us know down in the comments below what other topic you would like us to discuss. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so that you can see more of this content. We will meet you again very soon with more such videos. Until then, goodbye and take care.